Hello, my fellow YouTubers. This is the History Buff, and we are traveling with history. Today, I want to do something very fun. I want to give you facts about the presidents of the United States. We've had about 45 men in office. And let's get to it, huh? Our first president, of course, George Washington, the only one that's independent. Well, about his fun fact, the teeth he had were not wooden. That was a myth. He actually had slave teeth, or teeth from slaves. He purchased them from them in the North. Back then, they allowed that. It was a strange predicament. He also had ivory from animals. Now let's move on to the next president. This is President John Adams. He was George Washington's vice president for 8 years before winning the presidency in his own right in the election of 1796. He was the other one to be a Federalist. He served for 4 years. What's interesting about him, before he became president, before he was a diplomat, before he was a congressman, he was a lawyer. He was the defense attorney, or should I say representative, for the British soldiers that were arrested in the Boston Massacre after they fired on the villagers March 5th, 1770. He was a splendid lawyer, of course. Only two of them were found guilty of minor crimes of the massacre. Everyone else was scot-free. But of course, it did help his case that the prosecutor was rather incompetent. Terrible prosecutor, that can happen. But a win is a win. And John Adams took it because he was a man of the law. He didn't care what side you were on during the time. This was before he became a founding father, a patriot, if you may. He knew the law. He studied it, passed it down. But let's get on to another president. His close friend, and then rival, and then friend again. His successor, Thomas Jefferson. Well, this one may not be appropriate for the younger ones, but Thomas Jefferson was widowed. I mean, his wife, Martha Wills, passed away, and he did have affairs. Everybody knows about his affair with Sally Hemings, the children they had, but he was also intimate with married women. He was a womanizer, to say the least. And one particular love interest he had was Maria Causeway, an Italian-English painter. She was married to another man. They had sent love letters to each other while he was on his trip to Europe. And, well, it may have been more romanticism from his part. He really loved the ladies. I can't say that's the best example, but he was also the president with the second highest IQ, so he was a very smart man. And even the smartest of men can fall to their own desires. Thomas Jefferson was no exception to that rule. I guess he wanted this fun. But let's move on to his successor, who was his Secretary of State, and who also helped him found the Democratic Republican Party. Meet President James Madison, president during the War of 1812. He was also a lawyer, also very smart, also a very small man. He was 5'4" tall, 100 pounds. So he was the shortest president in U.S. history. Yeah, but I give him credit. He was also a man of the Constitution. He's the one that wrote the Bill of Rights. Of course, that was before his presidency. And the White House sadly burnt down during his term. I guess it was officially known as the Executive Mansion. It wouldn't be rebuilt until a successor. But I believe his presidency came true. Or he was at his best when he was leading his men after the burning of the White House. And he was pretty smart with money. And he also loved ice cream. But he was also a brilliant Secretary of State to Thomas Jefferson. Speaking of Secretary of State, let me get to James Madison's successor, who was his Secretary of State. Secretary of State to James Madison was President James Monroe, last of the founding fathers to be president, also Revolutionary War veteran, and also in the Delaware River crossing portrait would trade them all standing, which wouldn't be realistic because they would have all sank in that icy river. But the fun fact I wanted to mention about him was that, well, he was a slave owner, and obviously none of us should agree with slavery, but that was their standard back then. He sent many back to Africa, which they wanted, and for that, they named their capital after him, Monrovia, capital of Liberia. He is the only president in U.S. history to have a foreign capital named after him. It's pretty neat if you ask me. And his Secretary of State helped him with the Monroe Doctrine, which meant Europe wouldn't meddle in their affairs if America didn't meddle in Europe's affairs, such as with South America, for instance. It was a great doctrine which helped with future presidents. But let me move on to his Secretary of State who would succeed him as President of the United States in a controversial election. Meet President John Quincy Adams. He is the son of the second president, John Adams, and the first president to have a first lady who was foreign born, because his wife Louisa Adams was from London, England, I believe. My fun fact about John Quincy Adams is he was the president with the highest IQ. He was also a successful lawyer, and in my opinion, one of the best ex-presidents, since he was an abolitionist. I would argue the first president to truly be an abolitionist. But his best work, while he didn't get his vision through as president, was when he was a congressman up until his death of stroke. And say you may know about Armistead, where the slaves escaped their Spanish slave masters. And John Quincy Adams fought for their freedom by the law. He was successful. John Quincy Adams, brilliant man. He even fought for the natives to have their lands back. As a matter of fact, he was so anti-slavery that he was censored by Congress. Of course, there was also the fact that his presidency was won controversially, despite not having the majority of the electoral and popular votes. He was in second place with that, but his successor, who we'll talk about next, had first place, didn't have the majority either. So it's up to the House and the Senate to, vote. And it was said through a corrupt bargain of 1824 that Henry Clay voted for John Quincy Adams to be the next president if John Quincy Adams would make him his next Secretary of State. Because back then, being the Secretary of State was a stepping stone. In this case, it would be the last time. But who knows? That could change. Anyways, let me move on to his angry successor, Andrew Jackson, otherwise known as Old Hickory, also the father of the Democratic Party. Also one of the toughest son of a gun to ever be in the presidency. He'd been in many duels. He was very short-tempered. Even when his supposed assassin tried to shoot him, the gun misfired and Let's just say Andrew Jackson was angry, and he had to be pulled off his would-be assassin before he beat him to death. About resentment, but I can't blame him on that part. Well, the fun fact I liked about him was he was a Revolutionary War veteran. He was a prisoner of war. A British officer, or should I say a soldier, wanted him to shine his boots. Let's say Andrew Jackson refused. He was stubborn till the end. And he was scarred in the hand and the face for it. That, reinforced his hatred for the British, which I'm sure he used in the War of 1812 to fight against them. Battle of New Orleans, everyone. Strangely, the Battle of New Orleans happened after the United States and Great Britain made peace, but back then, communication wasn't as quick. He was smart for not only being the father of the Democratic Party, but for being an inspiring commander, a general. Of course, many natives won't use the $20 bill because of his Trail of Tears fiasco, but I'll say that for another time. Let's get on to his successor. Oh, I'm sorry. His successor was also Secretary of State before becoming his vice president. Martin Van Buren, called the Little Magician because he was really good at politics. He was a New Yorker, and he helped Andrew Jackson create the Democratic Party as we know it today. Also a Jacksonian Democrat. Martin Van Buren, the fun fact about him is he is the only president whose first language was not English. That was a second language. It was Dutch. It was from a Dutch family. Through ancestry. But he spoke English fluently. Very intelligent man. He really knew how to work the system, so to speak. He was the one that coined the term okay, because it was called Old Kinderhook. But it's ironic, he went from slave owner to later on in his life an abolitionist. It's interesting how things work out. Now, of course, he would go for one term, then he would lose re-election to a successor, William Henry Harrison, or we call him Old Tippecanoe because he was the hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe, Timberland Wars, and War of 1812. He was the last president born a British subject, which means born before 1776, which the United States officially became a thing instead of just colonies. 5'8", of course. Of course, he was also a slave owner, kind of, how do I say this, a trickster when it came to ripping off the natives. Kind of ripped them off their lands. That's before he became president. He was credited for the evolution of the Northwest Territory, again before he was president. He was also the first to die in office after a month. We used to think it was pneumonia, but apparently it was septic. I guess bad well water. An interesting fact about him was he dropped out of medical school because he couldn't afford it. He wanted to be a doctor, but he's joined the military instead. Of course, another fun fact is he was the son of Benjamin Harrison IV, who was a founding father. William Henry Harrison, the first to be a Whig, first to die in office, the last to be a British subject. Which leads me to his successor, President John Tyler. The man to kind of get the ball rolling on the annexation of Texas. Also, the man who got kicked out of his own party for vetoing a lot of Whig policies. He was called His Excellency because he was the vice president to William Henry Harrison, and he inherited the presidency, never won it in his own right. But I will tell you, he was determined, so he did settle that. I'd like to call him a wino, or a Whig in name only. He was a states' rights Whig. He used to be a Democrat. Of course, being kicked out of his own party, he tried. He never could earn the presidency in his own right. He, and last I heard, he still has a grandson alive to this day. Now keep in mind, this man was born in the late 18th century, and his presidency was from 1841 to 1845. His first wife, Letitia Tyler, died while he was president, didn't he? Later on married Julia Garner, who was 30 years his junior. He is also the president with the most kids, the offsprings. He had 15 children, 8 with his first wife, 7 with his second wife. An interesting fact about him, unfortunately, when the Civil War came, he joined the Confederate side. He won a seat in the Confederate Congress Hall, but he died of stroke before he could assume it in 1862. He was the only president buried without honors, unless you consider the Confederacy. In a weird way, it's an honor, not one I would want. Next president, James K. Polk, my favorite Jacksonian. Man, his fun fact was he was considered the most boring president. Considered boring? I guess him and I have a lot in common. He was called the Napoleon in the Stump. He was a great speaker, great orator. Because back then you spoke behind a stump, or on a stump, preferably. He was also a young hickory because he was Andrew Jackson's protege. Never had any children of his own. He also kept his promise to be a president for only one term, which he was from 1845 to 1849. Of course, he sadly died of cholera 3 months after he left office. Presided over the Mexican-American War. I guess I'll leave a story for him for another time. Get to his successor, old rough and ready, Zachary Taylor. Definitely, man, it looks like a soldier. And he was. He was also a farmer. And the second president to die in office, he was president from 1849 to 1850. He's also a slave owner. I guess the most interesting fact about him was he was nominated for president without knowing for weeks, because he got a paid postage. He got a postage that wasn't paid for. He refused to pay for it. He didn't learn until 3 weeks later. Yeah, of course, he's buried in Kentucky. That's where he lived a lot of his life. He was born in Virginia, though. He was known for his wars, but he was most known for the Mexican-American War. Which did make sense. He did a lot there. Regardless, I won't explain that. Again, I want to save one president at a time before I go over their lives. Future plans. Anyways, let's move on to his successor, his vice president. President Millard Fillmore. I guess he was what you call a doughface, a northerner that was pro-slavery. When you think of pro-slavery, you normally think of the South. And he was a lawyer, but for one thing that's interesting about his life, the fun fact was he married his own school teacher. She was 2 years older than him. That was his first wife. Of course, after his presidency, of course, she sadly passed. Then he married a rich widow who was 13 years his junior. Oh, he also helped fire the Congress library. So he did some things. Some say he looks like Alec Baldwin. I'll let you decide on that. Of course, like John Tyler, Millard Fillmore never earned the presidency in his own right. But he did his best, even later on. After his presidency, which was 1850-1853, let's just say he tried again in 1856, running for the Know Nothings, a radical right-wing party. Called the Know Nothings because when they answered, they said they know nothing. Kind of isolationist party. Anti-Catholic. Ironically called the Native American Party, despite them being mostly white. All whites. It's strange, I know. He lost that election badly, though. Third place, but had points for trying to get to a successor. Franklin Pierce. Now, let's just say he was the only president to keep his entire administration. Every other president had to switch members of cabinets, or replace them, better yet. He was also a close friend to Nathaniel Hawthorne, a famous author. And of course, he was a dough-faced like his predecessor, Millard Fillmore. He's probably the president I feel most sorry for, but again, story for another time. He was a Democrat. He was a veteran of the Mexican-American War. Let's just say he fell. His horse fell on his leg. He got stuck. His political opponents later on made fun of him for that. Though he did beat his old commander, Winfield Scott, for the presidency in the election, I believe, 1852. He served one term. Let's just say he wasn't very popular. He was that bad of a president. That's alright, I guess. Because his successor was much worse. His successor was the man, James Buchanan, also a Democrat. 1857 to 1861, historians see him as the worst president. I personally put him in my bottom 5, but that's my opinion. But yeah, I agree with him. He was a terrible president. But I can go into that reason. For his financial problems, being the last straw for the Civil War, slavery actions. But, strange, this guy's from Pennsylvania. He was a successful lawyer, a successful senator, a successful Secretary of State for James K. Polk, successful minister to Russia, I believe, minister to England, under Franklin Pierce, and then one of the worst presidents we've ever had. One term. Although, it was interesting. He had one of the, how do I say this, one of my favorite quotes in history. He told President-elect Abraham Lincoln, if you are as happy to go in the White House as I am to get back to the wheatlands, you are a happy man indeed. He was funny. My interesting fact about him was, well, he might have been gay. This was some historians suspect. Some suspect he had a relationship with Franklin Pierce's Vice President, William Rufus King. He might have been intimate with his own male cabinet members. I mean, he had a female fiance, but I better move on to that because his niece was Harriet Lane. His favorite niece, by the way. Now let's move on to his successor. Abraham Lincoln, known as the best president, one of my heroes. Man, it went from at times to abolitionist, slowly but surely. He was the tall 6'4". But since I'm burning time here, I'm gonna go into the fact that I love so much. He was in the Wrestling Hall of Fame. He only lost 1 out of 300 matches. This guy was tough. Sadly, he was also the first president murdered in office. The first to be Republican. His hero was Henry Clay. It was a Whig. But yeah, Abraham Lincoln. Andrew Johnson, his successor and vice president, was a Democrat turned to the Union Party. First one to be impeached and acquitted by 1 vote. But my interesting fact about him was he never really had a formal education. His wife, Eliza, taught him how to read and write. And he wasn't a very popular president. He was chased out of town a few times. He also fed some pet mice. Anyways, Ulysses Grant. If you don't know who he is, I'm surprised. He was the supreme commander of the Union in the Civil War. He was even lenient on the defeating Confederates. His fun fact is he saved Robert E. Lee from being charged with treason. He's that generous of a man. He had friends, both sides. Oh, he also smoked 20 cigars a day and died of throat cancer eventually. Unfortunate. I gotta move on. Let's read Birch Hayes. Ha! Again, one of my favorite ex-presidents. He wasn't one of the best presidents. And that was a controversial election. Rutherford, the election of 1876. Anyways, he did not serve alcohol in the White House, but his wife Lucy served lemonade. Called her Lemonade Lucy. They didn't want alcohol. I think they also did the first Easter egg roll. And now for James Garfield, sadly murdered, and in my opinion would have been one of the greatest presidents had he not been assassinated. But let me get to his fun fact. He was ambidextrous. He could write Greek in one hand and Latin in the other. Very smart man. One of our toughest presidents. Story for another time. Chester A. Arthur. I have much respect for him. He came in from a corrupt system only to fight against it as president. Known for his chops and his mustache. Chester A. Arthur owned 80 pairs of pants, personal valet. He was also the first president accused of not being born in the United States. He's either accused of being, how should I say, from Canada or Ireland. But he was actually from Vermont. People are just crazy. He didn't earn the presidency in his own right, but he did his best. Our only president to win 2 non-consecutive terms, Grover Cleveland. Bourbon Democrat, fiscally conservative Democrat. He was also a draft dodger for the Civil War, hired a Polish substitute who survived. Cleveland wanted to practice law. He did. Going to the interesting fact about him, the only president to marry in the White House, Frances Folsom, who was the daughter of his best friend Oscar Folsom. This one was weird, creepy, because he knew Frances since she was a little girl. Guess he waited for her to grow up. He courted her when she was in college. She liked older men. They got married. They had 5 kids together. And we'll go to Benjamin Harrison, the grandson of William Henry Harrison. And he was called Little Benny because he was 5'6". The Democrats made fun of him. Benjamin Harrison was a Republican. First president to have electricity in the White House. Oh, he's also a Civil War vet. Anyways, he never used electricity because he was afraid of being electrocuted. Different times back then. William McKinley, the 3rd president to be assassinated by Leon Schoenberg in the Music Temple. Last president to be a Civil War veteran. Favorite flower, the scarlet carnation, was made the official state flower of Ohio after he was murdered. They say he gave his lucky flower to a little girl before he was shot twice by Leon Schulges. And let's get to his vice president and successor, Theodore Roosevelt, one of my heroes. Also, the youngest man to become president, age 42, as of this recording. The only president to win the Medal of Honor way after his death, because he died in 1919. I guess Bill Clinton gave him the Medal of Honor, in a manner of speaking. But the only president to have that, and the first one to win the Nobel Peace Prize. The first president to fly in an airplane, but he was former president. Very tough guy, boxing, jiu-jitsu. He would have messed with Theodore Roosevelt. To his successor, Secretary of War, William Howard Taft, the heaviest man to become president of the United States. Also, the only man to be both president of the United States and Supreme Court Justice, Chief Supreme Court Justice. He lost a lot of weight because he preferred Chief Supreme Court Justice over the presidency. He had been sworn in. He had sworn in presidents like Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover. He is from Cincinnati, Ohio. Very smart man, constitutionalist before he was Republican. I would call him progressive conservative. And now this guy, Woodrow Wilson, the only president buried in Washington, D.C. And of course, first one to swear in a Jewish Supreme Court Justice, and the president during World War I. I'll leave my personal bias out of this one. Not a fan of Woodrow Wilson. He's my least favorite president. Anyways, moving on. Warren G. Harding. Let's just say everybody knows about him having a love trial with Nan Britton, one of his servants, and that being proven near the late 20th century when DNA was a thing. But he was also a gambler, loved poker. He was said to have bet all the china set in the warehouse, lost it all. I don't know how true this story is, but yeah. And the last president from Ohio is president from 1921 to 1923. Calvin Coolidge is vice president. Silent Cal. Let's just say he was the only president born on the 4th of July, 1872. He's also sworn in by his own father at first. And Warren G. Harding died and he succeeded him. That's before he won the presidency in his own right in 1826, I believe. Sorry, 1824, not 1826. 1824. He was Silent Cal. Man, a few words. Story for another time, I suppose. Herbert Hoover. It's also self-made millionaire. Geological engineering, I believe. His degree, he also helped in the Boxer Rebellion in China, guided the Marines, Very smart man. Had to preside over the Great Depression. Sadly, people only remember him for that. Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Distant cousin of Theodore Roosevelt and the only president to be, how should I say, a president for more than 2 terms. He was president from 1933 to 1945. He died in office of cerebral hemorrhage, sadly. I know he was planning to resign after World War II was done because he was getting tired of it. He made known for the New Deal. He also set up a polio rehab center in Georgia. He had polio much of his life. There's no real cure for it. But I'll get to the next one. Harry S. Truman. Give him hell, Harry. Well, he never gave him hell. He just told them the truth and they thought it was hell. Sadly, his own mother-in-law hated his guts because she felt no one was good enough for her daughter Bess. Although he was the last president to truly die in poverty, he refused a pension when it came out. Dwight D. Eisenhower. Now, let's just say he never saw personal combat, but he was a World War I and World War II veteran. In the academy, I believe. West Point, if I recall right. He was also very efficient for NASA. He used to want to start NASA on the Interstate Highway. I'll say that for another time. John F. Kennedy. Sadly, the last one to die in office to be assassinated. He intended to be the first president to visit Japan, but was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald before he could. His brother Robert F. Kennedy visited in his stead. Now for a successor and vice president, Lyndon B. Johnson. It was called Landslide Lyndon, which was not because of his presidential victory in 1964 against Barry Goldwater. It was because of his victory against Coke Stevenson in the election of 1948 for the Senate of Texas. That one got barely, and let's just say Coke Stevenson was winning most of the bit. That one's debated to this day. Could be fraudulent, could be not. Richard Nixon. I am not a crook. Anyways, terrible impersonation aside, there's a claim that he might be a descendant of King Edward III of England. I don't know if that's true or not, but some claim he was part of royalty. Interesting. Gerald R. Ford, second vice president, and the only man to be both vice president and president without being elected to either. Let's just say in order to earn money for law school, he was a male model. I guess he was a charmer amongst the ladies back then. Played college football. He could have went in the NFL, but he chose not to. Never lost his Congress match. All his times in Congress. Never lost a single match. Although he did narrowly lose to Jimmy Carter for the presidency in the election of 1976. Gerald Ford was sitting president, and Jimmy Carter was then just called Governor Carter. They were close friends later on. Go figure. Jimmy Carter, wonderful man. Maybe not the best president. I guess he got a lot of a mess. Apparently, he was an avid movie watcher. He watched over 400 films while he was in the White House. Honest man, peanut farmer. You know, they called his Air Force One Peanut Force One because of his background. He was quite a man, one of the best ex-presidents. Ronald Reagan, one of my heroes. 40th president. He was an actor, though he sadly never won an Oscar. He was also nearly strangled to death by a chimp in the film on the set for Bedtime for Bonzo. I'm glad he survived. Governor of California, also the President of the United States. Otherwise, he wouldn't be on this. And his vice president, we'll get on to George Herbert Walker Bush. The last president to be a World War II veteran, the youngest Navy pilot. Also went to Yale, I believe. And if I'm wrong with that, go ahead and correct me. I don't mind. He was also the father of another president. And of course, he was vice president of Ronald Reagan to 8 years. George Herbert Walker Bush was Republican president from 1989 to 1993. Anyways, let's move on to the next president, his successor, Democrat Bill Clinton. I love this one. One of my favorite facts. I know he was called a comeback kid because he came back during the presidential election of 1992 as Governor Clinton. My favorite fact was his get-it-done attitude inspired the personality for Sonic the Hedgehog. I grew up watching Sonic the Hedgehog and playing the games. But thank you, Mr. President, for that. Made my childhood awesome. George Walker Bush, the son of George Herbert Walker Bush. The president with an MBA, went to Yale and Harvard Business School. And he was also a cheerleader and an oil painter after his presidency. The man with both the highest and lowest approval ratings of the president's U.S. history. It's funny how things work out. Let me get on to his successor, who I believe was controversial, but Barack Obama. Whether you love him or hate him, he earned his way into the presidency. He's a Democrat, smooth speaker. Sure as Obamacare was controversial, but you know, he's like every other president. He's human, makes mistakes. He has his pros and cons. Let's just say the fun fact about him was he was born in Honolulu, Hawaii. He was the second president accused of being born outside the United States. He was accused of being born out of Kenya. That was, of course, ridiculous. The birther thing's all absurd. But his first job, I believe he scooped and served ice cream at a Baskin Robbins in Honolulu. Some say he loved ice cream, some say he hated it. I think I would hate it if I had that job. But he's in shape. Let's get to his successor. Another controversial man. Donald John Trump. His story is interesting. I guess I got a sad fact. Let's just say he doesn't touch a single drop of alcohol. There's a story behind that. His older brother, Fred Trump Jr., had struggled with alcoholism. As a pilot, if he died of alcoholism, that affected Donald Trump. Since then, let's just say he's not touched a bottle ever since. Man's prohibition is for himself. May not be the healthiest, but it's a sad story. Get to the final president for this. President Joe Biden, the oldest man to be elected president, the youngest senator, born in Pennsylvania, Senator of Delaware, long time, Vice President to Barack Obama, and of course, I will say, 46th president. Let's just say he had a stuttering problem as a child, but he overcame it. I understand his favorite movie is Chariots of Fire, and he loves ice cream. I don't know what to say. Poor man must be suffering from Alzheimer's, dementia. I don't make fun of that stuff ever, whether I like the president or not. The medical condition is not something I will make light of. Anyways, I think that's all I have for now. Hope you enjoyed this video. I'll have more videos in the future. Let's just say I enjoyed studying these guys. I can name them all in numerical order, by their political parties and their times in office. Have a good day. My source of pictures. Bye now.